My name is Diana Myers. I'm 28 now, but 15 years ago, when I was only 13, my own parents made me leave the only home I knew. Last week, they walked into my Uncle Harold's will reading with confident smiles and their own private attorney, completely convinced they were about to walk away with millions. Harold was the man who had raised me for the past 15 years, the person who stepped in when they walked away. But the moment attorney Margaret Morrison opened the sealed envelope and began to read, everything changed. Their smiles slowly disappeared, and when she reached Clause 7, my mother, the same woman who once told me I was no longer her daughter, suddenly jumped to her feet. Her face went pale, her mouth open, as if she couldn't believe what she had just heard. Before I tell you what happened next, take a second to like and subscribe if you enjoy stories about justice, family boundaries, and people finally facing the consequences of their choices. And I'd love to know where you're watching from right now. What time is it where you are? Tell me in the comments. To understand why my mother reacted that way, I have to take you back to the summer of 2010, when I was a 13-year-old girl who truly believed every problem in my family somehow started with me. I grew up in a modest house in southeast Portland, and I learned very early that love in our home was not shared equally. My father, Richard Myers, worked as an auto mechanic at a shop downtown. He was quiet, almost too quiet, and when he did speak, it was usually to agree with whatever my mother had already decided. My mother, Sandra, worked at the checkout line in a grocery store. At home, she ran everything with the cold certainty of someone who believed she knew exactly who deserved attention, support, and care. My older sister, Tiffany, was 2 years ahead of me. She had my mother's golden blonde hair, her bright blue eyes, and the same effortless laugh that made people instantly notice her. "Tiffany looks just like you did at her age, Sandra," people would say, and my mother would glow every single time. I looked like my late grandmother on my father's side. Brown hair, brown eyes, quiet nature. My mother never openly said that was a bad thing. She simply never seemed to have much to say about me at all. The difference between us showed in everything. For Tiffany's 15th birthday, my mother planned a real celebration. 15 guests, a 3-tier cake from the bakery on Hawthorne, and even a rented karaoke machine. 3 months later, for my 13th birthday, it was just the 4 of us sitting around the kitchen table with a discounted cake from the grocery store where my mother worked. The frosting only said, "Happy Birthday," no name. It was clearly a leftover cake from someone else's canceled order. I didn't fully understand what was happening until I was 12. That was when I found out Tiffany had a college savings account. It had been opened when she was 5 years old. 8 years of deposits, thousands of dollars put aside for her future. So I asked my mother why I didn't have one too. She looked at me as if the question had caught her completely off guard. "Tiffany needs money for college," she said. "You'll figure something out. You're good at adapting." That was the first time I truly understood my role in the family. I was the extra child, present, but never really chosen. Then came the summer of 2010, the summer that changed everything. In April, I applied for the Oregon STEM Summer Academy at Oregon State University. It was a 6-week residential program for students with strong potential in science and mathematics. The scholarship covered everything: tuition, room and board, and all materials. The total value was $4,200. I didn't tell anyone I had applied. In that house, I had learned not to let hope show too early. On May 15th, the acceptance letter arrived. More than 2,000 students from across Oregon had applied. Only 50 were selected. I was one of them. For one afternoon, just one, I felt like I mattered. Then Tiffany heard about a performing arts camp in California that her drama teacher had mentioned. It lasted 3 weeks, came with no scholarship, and cost $3,800. That night at dinner, my mother announced the decision she had already made in her mind. "Diana, you'll turn down that science program," she said calmly. We can't afford to send both of you to summer programs, and Tiffany's camp will help with her college applications." She said it as casually as if she were talking about what to make for dinner, not asking me to give up something I had earned on my own. I stared down at my plate. Then the words came out before I could stop them. "No." The entire table went silent. Even the refrigerator seemed quieter, like the whole house was holding its breath. "Excuse me?" my mother said. Her voice dropped into that cold, warning tone I had heard her use with customers at the grocery store when they tried to argue over expired coupons. "This scholarship isn't money you can move around," I said. My voice was trembling, but the words were clear. "I earned it. It belongs to me." My mother stared at me as if I had suddenly become someone she didn't recognize. "If you can't make sacrifices for this family," she said slowly, "then you are not part of this family." At 13, I thought she was just angry. I had no idea she meant every word. 3 days after that dinner, I came home from the public library and found everything I owned packed into 2 black bags on the front porch. My mother stood in the doorway with her arms crossed. She didn't look furious anymore. She looked calm, final, like someone who had just completed a task she had been putting off for too long. "I called Harold," she said. "He's coming to get you. From now on, you're his responsibility." I stood there on the porch of the only home I had ever known, trying to understand how my life had changed so completely in a single moment. Behind her, I saw my father standing in the hallway. He didn't look at me. He didn't say one word. Then I glanced up at the second-floor window. Tiffany was watching from behind the curtain. Our eyes met for a second, and then she stepped back into the darkness of her room. She never came downstairs. I waited on that porch from 6 in the evening until 10 at night. 4 hours. My mother went back inside after the first few minutes. The porch light was never turned on. Uncle Harold lived in Seattle, 3 hours away. He drove through the night to reach me. When his gray Honda pulled into the driveway, I was still sitting on top of those bags with my knees pulled against my chest. He got out of the car and didn't say anything at first. He just walked up to me, looked at my face, and pulled me into a hug so tight I could barely breathe. "From now on," he said quietly, "you have a home." That night, as we drove north through the dark toward Seattle, I had no idea that my mother had signed a document before Uncle Harold left. I didn't know what was written in it. I didn't understand how important it would become. I was just a frightened kid staring out the window, wondering what I had done to deserve any of it. It would take 15 years for that document to appear again. And when it did, it changed everything. Uncle Harold's house in Seattle's Ballard neighborhood wasn't huge, but to me, it felt enormous compared to the small, uncomfortable space I had taken up in my parents' home. For the first time in my life, I had a room that was completely mine. But more than that, I finally had someone who believed I was worth choosing. Uncle Harold had built Myers Property Holdings from nothing. It was a commercial real estate company he started with one small office building, bought after years of working double shifts and saving every dollar he could. By 2010, he owned 8 properties across the Seattle metro area. He had never married. He had no children of his own. So when I arrived at his door with nothing but 2 bags and a broken sense of belonging, he didn't just give me shelter. He gave me a future. Over the next 4 years, I put everything I had into school. In 2014, I graduated from Ballard High as class valedictorian, president of the math club, with a perfect 4.0 unweighted GPA. The University of Washington accepted me into the Foster School of Business with a partial scholarship. By 2018, I had earned my bachelor's degree in finance, graduating summa cum laude with a 3.94 GPA. Uncle Harold also gave me the chance to learn the family business from the inside. Starting my sophomore year of college, I interned at Myers Property Holdings. I didn't begin at the top. I started with data entry, lease analysis, tenant communication, and property reports. I learned every part of the company from the ground up. In 2019, after 18 months at a major accounting firm I'll call Mitchell & Partners, I earned my CPA certification. A year later, Uncle Harold offered me the role of controller. By 2021, I had become CFO. On my 26th birthday, I was managing a portfolio of 12 commercial properties worth a combined $23.7 million. That day, Uncle Harold sent me an email. I still have it saved. The subject line said, "To my daughter." The message was short, but I have never forgotten it. You don't need to prove anything to the people who walked away from you, but you do need to prove to yourself that you are worthy. Happy birthday, Diana. Over the next 15 years, my biological family contacted me only 3 times. The first time was in 2012. My mother didn't call me, she called Uncle Harold. She asked him for $5,000 because my father had lost his job at the auto shop. Things were difficult, she said, and surely Harold could help his own brother. Uncle Harold said no. He told me about the call afterward, his jaw tense with frustration. "They didn't ask about you once," he said. "Not how you're doing in school, not whether you're okay, nothing. They only wanted money." The second time was in 2016. Tiffany sent me a wedding invitation in the mail. There was no handwritten note, no "I hope you're doing well," no attempt to reconnect. Just a formal printed card with my name on it, sent to Uncle Harold's address in Seattle. I didn't go. I didn't send a gift. I didn't answer. The third time was in 2020. My mother sent me an email. It was the first time she had contacted me directly since the day she made me leave home. The subject line said, "Checking in." In the message, she mentioned that she had seen an article in the Seattle Business Journal about Myers Property Holdings expanding into the East Side market. She said she hoped I was doing well, and suggested that maybe we should catch up sometime. I deleted it without replying. It wasn't because I was spending my life holding on to anger. It was much simpler than that. I had built a life without them in it, and I saw no reason to open a door they had closed years ago. Then, in the summer of 2024, everything changed. Uncle Harold received a diagnosis that none of us were ready for. His heart condition had reached an advanced stage, and the doctors told us we likely had 12 to 18 months. We got 8. During those final months, Uncle Harold met with his estate attorney several times. In June of 2024, 6 months before he was gone, he updated his will. When I asked him about it, he only smiled. "Everything is taken care of," he said. "You focus on the business. I've handled the rest." I didn't know what he had written. I didn't know about the clauses. I simply trusted him. And I had no idea what was coming. Uncle Harold passed peacefully on February 28, 2025, at Swedish Medical Center, with my hand wrapped around his. 1 week later, on March 7th, I was sitting in my office at Myers Property Holdings when my phone buzzed with a number I didn't recognize. It was from Portland. I almost let it ring. "Diana?" I knew the voice immediately. 15 years had passed, but my mother still said my name the same way, like it was something she wasn't sure she wanted in her mouth. "Sandra," I said. Not Mom, Sandra. There was a short silence. I could almost hear her adjusting to that. "I heard about Harold," she said. I'm so sorry for your loss. I was thinking I should come up for the memorial service, pay my respects. The memorial was 3 days ago. Another pause. Oh. Well, I also heard there's a will reading coming up. Family has a right to attend these things, you know, especially when it involves a brother's estate. And there it was, the real reason she had called. How did you find out about the will reading? I have an attorney, she said. Victor Harrington. He made some calls. The name stirred a faint memory. Uncle Harold had mentioned Victor Harrington once. He was an attorney Harold had spoken with years earlier and then decided not to hire. The next morning, I spoke with Margaret Morrison, Uncle Harold's estate attorney. She confirmed exactly what I had suspected. Sandra had hired Victor Harrington to file a claim challenging the will. Their argument was that I had influenced Harold unfairly during his final months. They were also demanding the right to attend the estate reading as immediate family members. I sat at my desk, staring at the framed photo of Uncle Harold beside my computer. In the picture, he was smiling. And for a second, it almost felt like he had known this moment would come, like he had planned for it. Margaret Morrison's office was on the 47th floor of the Columbia Center, the tallest building in Seattle. On a clear day, you could see all the way to Mount Rainier through the floor-to-ceiling windows. But March 10th was not clear. Rain slid down the glass as Margaret placed a document on the desk in front of me. Victor Harrington has filed a formal challenge to the will on behalf of Richard and Sandra Myers, she said. The claim says you placed undue influence on Harold. They're arguing that you isolated him from his family during his illness and pushed him to change his estate plan. I read through the document, feeling my stomach tighten with every paragraph. They're demanding 50% of the estate, Margaret continued. Their legal theory is that, as Harold's only surviving sibling, Richard should be entitled to inherit under intestacy rules, or at the very least receive a significant share based on the natural bond between brothers. Natural bond? I repeated. I looked up from the page. Richard and Harold hadn't spoken in 8 years before I came to live with him. Did you know that? Margaret nodded. I know, she said. Harold told me the entire history. But that isn't the part of this filing that concerns me most. Margaret pulled another page from her folder and placed it in front of me. They don't necessarily have to win, she said. If this goes into litigation, the estate could be tied up for 12 to 18 months during discovery and trial. During that time, the properties still need to be managed, tenants still need support, and expenses still have to be covered. A drawn-out legal fight could cost hundreds of thousands of dollars and damage the value of the entire portfolio. So they're hoping I'll pay them just to make them disappear, I said. That appears to be the strategy, Margaret replied. It's common in estate disputes. I looked down at the filing again. In the section where Sandra described our family history, she claimed that I had walked away from my family and taken advantage of Harold's loneliness. The woman who had sent me away was now accusing me of being the one who left. Margaret studied my face for a moment. Do you have any documents from 2010? She asked. Anything that helps prove what actually happened when you went to live with Harold? I thought back to that night. The front porch, the 2 black bags, the 4 hours in the dark, Uncle Harold's car pulling into the driveway. I was 13, I said quietly. I wasn't exactly saving paperwork. Harold was. Margaret was already reaching for her phone. She called her assistant and asked for a specific file from the archives. 20 minutes later, the assistant returned with an old yellow folder. Margaret opened it carefully, scanned the first few pages, and then looked up at me with an expression I couldn't quite understand. "Diana," she said, "did you know about this?" She slid the document across the desk. At the top, it read, "Voluntary relinquishment of parental rights and transfer of guardianship." The date was July 15th, 2010. The document stated that Richard James Myers and Sandra Ellen Myers, both of sound mind, voluntarily gave up all parental rights and responsibilities for their minor daughter, Diana Marie Myers, and transferred full legal guardianship to Harold Raymond Myers. At the bottom were 4 signatures: my mother's, my father's, Uncle Harold's, and a notary public from King County, Washington. File number 2010-GH5847. Margaret's voice softened. "They didn't just send you away," she said. "They signed a legal document. They gave up their parental rights. In the eyes of the law, Sandra and Richard Myers stopped being your parents the moment they signed this." My hands started to tremble. I had been 13 years old, sitting outside on the porch in the dark, thinking I had simply been rejected. I had no idea that while I was waiting out there, my mother had been inside signing papers that made it official. "What does this mean for their claim?" I asked. Margaret's expression changed. "It means Richard's position is much weaker than he realizes. He's trying to claim inheritance based on a family connection, but he legally severed that connection 15 years ago. He put it in writing, with witnesses." Then Margaret gave me 2 options. "Option 1, she said, we negotiate. I contact Harrington, explain that their case is not as strong as they think, and offer a settlement. Maybe $500,000 to $1 million, in exchange for them withdrawing the challenge and signing away any future claims. It would be faster, quieter, and cleaner." And option 2? "We move forward with the will reading exactly as planned. They demanded to attend as family, so we let them attend. Then we present the evidence, the guardianship transfer, the history. Everything Harold instructed me to disclose if they ever challenged the estate." She paused. "Harold expected this, Diana. He left specific instructions for this exact situation. He wanted the truth placed on the record." That night, I went home and couldn't sleep. I sat in the living room of the house Uncle Harold had left me, staring at the photos on the mantel. There were pictures of every major moment in my life: my high school graduation, my college commencement, the day I received my CPA license, my first day as CFO. And in every single picture, Uncle Harold stood beside me, smiling like he couldn't have been prouder. There were no photos of Richard or Sandra. Not one. I thought about the words Harold had written to me years earlier. I didn't owe them anything, but I did owe myself the truth. At 7 the next morning, I called Margaret. "I want the will reading to go forward," I told her. "No settlement, no buyout. If they want to be there, let them be there. But we are not hiding anything." "Are you sure?" Margaret asked. "Once this becomes part of the record, it may not stay private." "They chose to make this public when they filed that challenge," I said. "I'm only respecting their decision." The will reading was scheduled for Friday, March 14th, 2025 at 2 p.m. in the conference room at Morrison & Associates. It was 5 days away. The days leading up to it felt unreal. Everything moved quickly, yet somehow every hour dragged. My best friend, Elena Torres, helped me organize the documents. We had met 3 years earlier when she joined Myers Property Holdings as our HR director. And aside from Margaret, She was the only person who knew the full truth about what my childhood had been like. On Wednesday evening, she sat across from me in my office, scrolling through her laptop. 47 emails, she said, looking up. 47 emails from Harold to you over 10 years. They document his relationship with you, and they also explain why he had already distanced himself from Richard. Those emails told the real story clearly. Back in 2002, Richard had borrowed $80,000 from Harold and promised to pay it back within 5 years. More than 2 decades later, not a single dollar had been returned. That broken promise had damaged their relationship long before I ever moved to Seattle. My arrival in 2010 had not caused the distance between them. It had already existed for 8 years. Elena also pulled the financial reports from my time as CFO. During my 3 years in that role, the Myers Property Holdings portfolio had grown from $17.7 million to $23.7 million. That was a 34% increase in value. Occupancy rates averaged 96%. Tenant satisfaction scores were the highest the company had ever recorded. The evidence was clear. I had not taken advantage of Uncle Harold. I had helped protect and grow what he built. On Thursday evening, I met with Dr. Lauren Hayes, the therapist I had been seeing since my early 20s. She listened quietly as I explained everything. Then she said, "Remember why you're doing this. You're not trying to get even. You're closing a chapter. There's a difference." "What if I feel satisfied when they finally realize they lost?" I asked. Dr. Hayes gave me a gentle smile. "That's not cruelty, Diana. That's validation. Feeling relief when the truth is finally seen is not the same as wanting to hurt anyone. What matters is what you do after that moment." I drove home that night through Seattle's rain-covered streets, thinking about what she had said. Before bed, I stood in front of the bathroom mirror and looked at myself. "She has no power over you anymore," I told my reflection. "Only you get to decide your story now." Friday was coming, and I was ready. Let me pause here for a second. If you've stayed with me this far and you're wondering what happened next, drop your prediction in the comments. What do you think Sandra did when the will was finally read? And if this story connects with you, especially if you've ever had to create distance from people who were supposed to protect you, make sure you subscribe. Because now, we're getting to the part everyone has been waiting for. Now, back to that Friday afternoon. The conference room at Morrison & Associates sat in the corner of the 47th floor, surrounded by floor-to-ceiling windows with a wide view of Elliott Bay and the Olympic Mountains in the distance. On a clear day, it would have been stunning. But March 14th, 2025 was not clear. The sky was heavy with clouds, and the water below was a cold steel gray that matched exactly how I felt inside. I arrived 15 minutes early, at 1:45 p.m. I wore a tailored navy blue suit. Simple, professional, controlled. My hair was pulled back into a neat bun. Uncle Harold had taught me something years earlier. The most powerful person in the room usually doesn't need to announce it. The conference room had enough space for 20 people at the main table, with extra chairs along the walls. When I walked in, 14 people were already there. Margaret Morrison sat at the head of the table with 2 junior associates beside her. Near the window sat Thomas Graham, the senior auditor from Mitchell & Partners who had handled Uncle Harold's accounts for the past decade. Representatives from 3 charities occupied several of the chairs: Seattle Children's Hospital, Habitat for Humanity Northwest, and the Olympic National Park Foundation. Uncle Harold had supported all 3 for more than 20 years. 5 senior staff members from Myers Property Holdings sat together near the door. They had worked with Harold for years, and they had known me since I was just an intern learning how to read lease agreements and property reports. Margaret caught my eye and nodded toward the seat at the center of the table, directly across from where she would read the will. I sat down and placed the folder Elena had prepared neatly in front of me. Through the glass wall of the conference room, I could see the elevator lobby. At 2:03 p.m., the elevator doors opened. My mother stepped out first. Even from across the room, I could tell she had dressed carefully for the occasion. A black dress, pearl necklace, full makeup. Behind her came my father, my sister, and a man in an expensive suit carrying a Mont Blanc briefcase. The performance was about to begin. Sandra Myers entered the conference room as if she owned it. That had always been her way. She projected confidence she hadn't earned and claimed space no one had offered her. Her black dress looked brand new, and the pearls around her neck caught the overhead lights as she looked around the room with a practiced expression of quiet sorrow. Behind her, my father, Richard, walked in wearing a gray suit that no longer fit him properly. He had gained weight since the last time I had seen him. His eyes landed on me for one brief second before he looked away. Richard had always been good at looking away. Tiffany came in next, wearing a pastel pink dress, which felt strange for a will reading. It almost looked like she had misunderstood the occasion entirely. At 30, she looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with travel. Their attorney, Victor Harrington, entered last. He was tall, silver-haired, and carried the polished confidence of someone who had spent decades in expensive conference rooms, speaking for people who believed money could solve anything. His Mont Blanc briefcase probably cost more than my first month's salary at Mitchell & Partners. Sandra's eyes moved across the room until they stopped on me. "Ah," she said, her voice carrying just enough for everyone to hear. "You're already here." I didn't stand. Sandra. One word. Her name. Not Mom, just Sandra. For a moment, she stopped mid-step. Something flashed across her face. Then, just as quickly, she recovered. "I was hoping we could speak privately before this begins," Sandra said. "Family matters should be handled by family." "The proceedings begin in 2 minutes," I replied. "I'm sure whatever you need to say can wait." Margaret Morrison stood from her seat. "Mrs. Myers, Mr. Myers, Ms. Myers, Mr. Harrington," she said professionally. "Seats have been arranged for attending parties along the wall. The main table is reserved for beneficiaries and estate representatives." Sandra's jaw tightened. She had expected to be placed at the center of the room. Instead, she had been directed to the side. She wasn't even being seated at the table. Of course, Sandra didn't sit down quietly. On her way to the chairs, she paused near the representatives from Seattle Children's Hospital and introduced herself with a polished expression of grief. "I'm Sandra Myers," she said, loud enough for most of the room to hear. "Harold's sister-in-law. We were very close for many years before this unfortunate distance came between us." Her eyes shifted toward me for just a moment. Dr. Patricia Wells, the hospital representative, gave a polite nod but didn't respond. Sandra kept going anyway. "It's heartbreaking how certain people can enter a family and create division. Harold was such a generous man, so trusting, maybe too trusting." I kept my eyes on the folder in front of me. I said nothing. I had learned a long time ago that Sandra needed reactions the way other people needed air. Tiffany, settling into one of the chairs against the wall, decided to add her own comment. "Uncle Harold used to visit us in Portland all the time when we were kids," she said. "I don't understand why she gets to sit up there while we're back here." Victor Harrington was already writing on his legal pad. Every word, every gesture, every tiny movement. He was looking for something he could use later. So I gave him nothing. Sandra finally sat beside Tiffany, but she still wasn't finished. As Margaret arranged her papers at the head of the table, Sandra's voice cut through the room one more time. "A child whose own parents step away usually gives them a reason," she said. "I only wish Harold had understood her the way we did. A mother always knows." The room went tense. Several people shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Thomas Graham, the auditor, stared at Sandra like he couldn't believe she had said that out loud. For the first time in 15 years, I looked directly at my mother, really looked at her. And I realized she hadn't changed. The same certainty, the same need to control the story, the same absolute belief that she was the one who had been wronged. Margaret cleared her throat. "It is 2:10. We will begin." She broke the seal on a large envelope with calm, practiced precision. "This is the last will and testament of Harold Raymond Myers," she began, her voice formal and clear. "Born July 4th, 1953. Passed away February 28th, 2025. This document was executed on June 18th, 2024. And represents the final expression of Mr. Myers's wishes regarding the distribution of his estate." Sandra leaned forward slightly, her pearl necklace catching the light. Margaret continued through the opening sections. Article 1 confirmed Harold's identity and residence. Article 2 stated that he was of sound mind and fully capable of making decisions about his estate. Margaret also noted that a professional capacity evaluation had been completed by Dr. Stephen Park on June 10, 2024, just 8 days before the will was signed. The evaluation confirmed that Mr. Myers possessed full testamentary capacity and was acting freely at the time of execution. Margaret read. I saw Sandra glance at Victor Harrington. They had clearly been hoping to question Harold's state of mind. That line made their strategy much harder. Article 3 revoked all previous wills and codicils. Then Margaret turned to Article 4, the inventory of assets. At the time of his passing, Mr. Myers's estate included the following: 12 commercial properties located throughout King County and Snohomish County, with a combined assessed value of $18.2 million. Investment accounts containing diversified equity holdings valued at approximately $4.1 million. Cash and liquid assets totaling $1.4 million. I heard Tiffany whisper to Sandra, "That's almost $24 million." Sandra gave a small nod, her eyes suddenly sharp and calculating. Margaret looked up briefly. The will contains 47 pages. I will now proceed to Article 5, which addresses specific bequests and exclusions. She turned the page and adjusted her reading glasses. Article 5. Regarding Richard James Myers, brother of the testator. Sandra smiled. For one brief second, she actually smiled. But it didn't last. Margaret's voice remained even as she read the next line. I make no provision in this will for my brother, Richard James Myers, for the following reasons, which I wish to be read aloud and entered into the record. Sandra's smile faded. Margaret continued, reading Uncle Harold's words exactly as he had left them. First, in March of 2002, Richard borrowed $80,000 from me with a written promise to repay the full amount within 5 years. 23 years have passed, and not a single dollar has been returned. I have kept the original promissory note as documentation. Richard's face lost its color. He had not expected Harold to bring that up. Second, on July 15, 2010, Richard and his wife, Sandra, voluntarily signed a legal document giving up all parental rights to their daughter, Diana Marie Myers, and transferring full guardianship to me. This document was properly witnessed and notarized. Sandra suddenly stood up. "What does that have to do with anything?" Margaret paused, looked at Sandra over the top of her glasses, and then continued reading without responding to the interruption. The importance of this document is as follows. By legally ending their parental relationship with Diana, Richard and Sandra also ended any claim they might attempt to make through her. Diana is my legal heir. Richard is not her legal father. Therefore, Richard has no family-based connection to my designated heir, and no standing to challenge this will on those grounds. Richard stood up now, too. "This is ridiculous. I'm Harold's brother, his actual brother." Victor Harrington quickly reached for Richard's arm and pulled him back toward his chair. But even Victor looked unsettled now. Margaret opened her file and removed another document. For the record, the original voluntary relinquishment of parental rights is filed with King County Family Court under file number 2010-GH5847. I have a certified copy here, available for review by any party present. She placed the document on the table. Sandra stared at it as if it might ruin everything. And in many ways, it already had. She didn't sit down. The polished, grieving mask she had worn into the room began to crack. Her voice rose, sharp and shaken. "This is absurd. That paper doesn't mean anything. We're still her family." Margaret stayed calm. "Mrs. Myers, I need to ask you to return to your seat. Interrupting the reading of a will is a serious matter." Sandra ignored her. She pointed straight at me. "She did this. She turned Harold against his own family. She made him believe things that weren't true." Dr. Patricia Wells from Seattle Children's Hospital shifted uncomfortably in her chair. The charity representatives clearly had not expected to witness a family confrontation. Tiffany reached for Sandra's sleeve. "Mom, sit down. Everyone's watching." "I don't care who's watching," Sandra snapped, her voice breaking. "I want to know how this happened. Harold loved Richard. They were brothers." That was when I finally spoke. My voice was calm and steady, exactly the way Uncle Harold had taught me to speak during difficult negotiations. Never raise your voice. Make them listen. Sandra, you made a choice 15 years ago. You packed my belongings into garbage bags and left me outside in the dark. Then you went back inside and signed a document giving me away. I was 13 years old. The room went completely still. "That was your decision," I continued. "Not mine, not Uncle Harold's. Yours. Everything happening today is simply the result of the choice you made that night." Sandra opened her mouth, but no words came out. I held her gaze. "I don't carry bitterness toward you, but I also don't owe you anything. You made sure of that when you signed that paper." Victor Harrington kept writing quickly on his legal pad, though I couldn't imagine what was left for him to defend. Margaret cleared her throat. "If we may continue, I have not yet read Clause 7. Sandra finally lowered herself back into her chair. But Clause 7 was the part that would truly end her hopes. Margaret turned to page 12 of the will and paused. Then she read the words that changed everything. Article 7. Designation of sole beneficiary. The room seemed to hold its breath. "I hereby bequeath the entirety of my estate, including all real property, investment accounts, liquid assets, and personal effects. To my legally adopted daughter, Diana Marie Myers. Adopted. The word landed in the room like a final verdict. Sandra's face went completely pale. Adopted? Richard asked, his voice rough. Since when? Margaret answered with the same calm precision she had maintained from the beginning. Mr. Harold Myers formally adopted Diana Marie Myers on September 12, 2012, when she was 15 years old. The adoption was finalized in King County Family Court under file number 2012-AD3291. Since Mr. and Mrs. Richard Myers had already legally relinquished their parental rights in 2010, no additional consent was required. Tiffany stared at me. So you're not even related to us anymore? I met her eyes. Not legally. Not since Mom and Dad signed me away. Margaret continued reading. Diana is not merely a beneficiary. She is my daughter in every way that matters, legally, practically, and emotionally. She has worked beside me for years, proven her ability and integrity, and I trust her completely to continue the work I began. There is no one more deserving of this inheritance, and no one I love more. My vision blurred. I blinked quickly, trying to hold back tears. Uncle Harold had never told me the full wording of that clause. He had kept it hidden, almost as if he knew there might come a day when those words would need to be heard in a room full of witnesses. Sandra kept shaking her head slowly, like she was trying to convince herself this wasn't really happening. This can't be legal, she whispered. Victor, tell them this can't be legal. Victor Harrington didn't answer. He just stared down at his legal pad, his pen completely still. He knew. The case was falling apart right in front of him. Then Margaret reached into her folder and took out a smaller, sealed envelope. There is one more item, she said. Mr. Myers left a personal letter for Diana. His instructions were that I offer to read part of it aloud during this proceeding, but only with Diana's consent. I nodded. I didn't trust myself to speak. Margaret opened the envelope carefully and unfolded a single handwritten page. Uncle Harold's handwriting filled it. The same handwriting I had seen on birthday cards, office notes, and little messages he had left on my desk over the years. Margaret began to read. Diana, if this letter is being read aloud, then things happened exactly the way I expected. Your biological family arrived looking for money they did not earn from a man they did not truly value. I am sorry you have to face this, but I also know you are strong enough to get through it. A small sound came from Sandra, almost like she had lost her breath. Margaret continued. You came to me as a hurting child, pushed aside by the people who were supposed to protect you. But you never allowed that to become the whole story of who you were. You turned pain into focus, loneliness into independence, and rejection into strength. I have never been prouder of anyone in my life. Margaret's voice softened as she read the next lines. I did not save you, Diana. You saved yourself. I only gave you a safe place to do it. Everything you have achieved, your education, your career, your character, you earned through your own effort. I am leaving you my estate not because you need it, but because you deserve it. And because I know you will use it to help others the way I tried to help you. Tears were running down my face now. This time, I didn't try to hide them. Do not let them make you feel guilty for building a life beyond them. Do not let them back into your world unless that is truly what you choose. You owe them nothing. You owe yourself everything. I love you, Diana. Forever your father, Harold. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Sandra made one final attempt. She stood again, but this time her voice was different. The sharp anger was gone. In its place was something softer, something carefully shaped to sound like a mother in pain. Diana, sweetheart, she said, I know things were difficult when you were young. I made mistakes. I can admit that now. But we're still family by birth. We can move past this. Can't we at least talk about dividing the estate in a way that feels fair? I wiped my eyes and looked at her. You gave up the right to call me sweetheart 15 years ago. Sandra's expression hardened. I want to contest this will, she announced to the room. Victor, tell them we have grounds. Harold was unwell. She kept him away from us. She influenced him. Victor Harrington finally spoke, but his voice had lost all the confidence he'd walked in with. Mrs. Myers, perhaps we should discuss your options privately. No, Sandra snapped. Tell them we're going to fight this. Before he could respond, Margaret turned her iPad around so the room could see the screen. Mr. Harrington, she said, perhaps you would like to explain this to your clients. The room went quiet. Margaret read from the screen. This is an email dated March 3rd, 2022, from Harold Myers to Victor Harrington. The subject line is Terminating Services. In the email, Mr. Myers writes, Victor, I am ending our professional relationship. Your advice that I include Richard in my estate plan, despite his years of financial misuse and his treatment of Diana, is unacceptable. I will be engaging new counsel. Margaret looked directly at Victor. You previously represented Harold Myers. He ended that relationship because he believed you were pushing Richard's interests over Harold's wishes. And now you have accepted a case against Harold's estate without clearly disclosing that conflict to your current clients. Victor's face turned a dull gray. Sandra slowly turned toward him. You told me we would win. He had no answer. Victor Harrington stood abruptly, grabbing his Mont Blanc briefcase with hands that were no longer steady. I need to review these documents, he said, his polished tone completely gone. We should discuss your options privately, Mrs. Myers. Discuss what? Sandra's voice started rising again. You're leaving right now? In the middle of this? Victor didn't answer. He was already walking toward the door, stiff and fast, like a man who suddenly understood that the situation had become much bigger than he expected. Victor! Sandra called after him. Victor! The conference room door closed behind him with a quiet click. Sandra stood there, frozen. Her own attorney had just walked out, leaving her alone in front of every person she had tried so hard to impress. Richard hadn't spoken for several minutes. He sat slumped in his chair, staring down at the floor. For most of his life, he had followed Sandra's lead without question, and now she had led both of them straight into a situation they couldn't escape. Tiffany was crying quietly. I couldn't tell whether she was upset about losing the money, being embarrassed in front of strangers, or finally seeing our family history laid out so clearly. Sandra turned toward me one more time. The mask was gone now. There was no polished sorrow, no controlled confidence, no performance, just desperation. And beneath it, maybe, for the first time, the smallest sign of real regret. Diana, she said, her voice breaking. We can still... we're still family, aren't we? Blood is blood. You could still... I stood from the table. Sandra, You stopped being my family on July 15th, 2010. You signed that document yourself. I didn't make that choice. You did. I picked up my folder and looked at her steadily. I don't hate you. Honestly, I feel sorry for you. But you have no claim on me. Not legally, not emotionally, not in any way that matters anymore. Then I turned to Margaret. Can we continue with the remaining articles? Margaret nodded. Sandra lowered herself back into the chair. She didn't say another word for the rest of the reading. Margaret turned to the next section with her usual calm professionalism. Article 9. Charitable Bequests. The representatives from the three organizations sat a little straighter. I direct that the following gifts be made from my estate. $500,000 to Seattle Children's Hospital to establish a scholarship fund for children from disadvantaged backgrounds. $300,000 to Habitat for Humanity Northwest to support the construction of affordable housing in the greater Seattle area. $200,000 to the Olympic National Park Foundation for wilderness preservation and environmental education programs. Dr. Patricia Wells from Seattle Children's Hospital nodded with quiet emotion. Harold was one of our most faithful donors for more than 20 years, she said. This gift will help hundreds of families. The representative from Habitat for Humanity added, his previous donations helped us build 6 homes. This will fund at least 4 more. Margaret continued reading. I also request that my daughter Diana continue the charitable giving programs I established during my lifetime, at her own discretion. I trust her judgment completely. I found my voice. I will, I said. I'll honor everything Uncle Harold built. As I looked at the 3 charity representatives seated around the room, something clicked into place. They weren't there because the law required them to be. They were there because Uncle Harold had wanted them there. He had wanted witnesses, neutral people, respected people. People who could later confirm exactly what had happened in that room if Sandra and Richard tried to twist the story again. Even after he was gone, Harold had planned ahead. Dr. Wells caught my eye and gave me a small, kind smile. Harold talked about you constantly, she said. At every board meeting, every donor event, Diana did this, Diana achieved that. He was so proud of you. I had to blink back another wave of tears. Even after losing him, Uncle Harold had somehow surrounded me with people who believed in me. When Margaret finished reading the final sections of the will, she turned to me. Diana, as sole beneficiary and executor, would you like to say a few words? I hadn't planned to speak, but everyone in that room was watching me, and I realized there were things I needed to say. Not for Sandra, for myself. I stood. Most of you knew Uncle Harold much longer than I did. He took me in when I was 13 years old and had nothing. He gave me a home, an education, and most importantly, he gave me a family that chose me. I looked around the room at the Myers Property Holdings employees, who had watched me grow from a nervous intern into the company's CFO. Then at the charity representatives, who had seen Harold's kindness in action for decades. With this inheritance, I intend to continue everything Harold built. The properties will be managed with the same integrity he believed in. The charitable commitments will continue. And I'll be establishing a new scholarship fund, the Myers STEM Scholarship, for children from difficult family situations who need someone to believe in them. My eyes moved to Sandra, still sitting stiffly in her chair. As for my biological relatives, I do not hold a grudge. I've made peace with what happened. But peace does not mean pretending the past didn't happen, and it does not mean reopening doors I worked very hard to close. I took a steady breath. Harold taught me that family is a choice. Family is made of the people who show up when everything falls apart. By that definition, the people in this room who knew Harold, worked with him, respected him, and loved what he built are more my family than the people who only share my DNA. I sat back down. For a long moment, the room was completely quiet. Then Thomas Graham, the auditor, began to clap. One by one, the others joined him. Sandra didn't move. Margaret formally ended the reading at 3:47 p.m. The will has now been read in full. All legal requirements have been satisfied. Ms. Myers, you may contact our office next week to begin the transfer process. The estate should be fully settled within 14 business days. People began standing, gathering their things, and speaking quietly among themselves. Sandra rose slowly, like someone who had aged years in a single afternoon. Richard was already moving toward the door, eyes down, avoiding everyone. Tiffany picked up her purse and followed him without saying a word. Sandra stayed behind for a moment. She turned and looked at me one last time. Her makeup had smudged slightly around her eyes. The confident woman who had entered that conference room expecting millions now looked smaller somehow. Less certain. Less untouchable. She opened her mouth as if she might say something. For 1 second, I thought I saw the beginning of an apology. But then she closed her mouth, turned away, and walked out. I watched her leave. This was the woman who had pushed me out of her life, signed the papers to make it official, and then returned 15 years later expecting to benefit from the life I had built without her. And in that moment, I felt something I still don't know how to name. It wasn't joy. It wasn't revenge. It was quieter than that. It was the strange emptiness that comes when a chapter finally ends. As the room began to clear, Dr. Wells from Seattle Children's Hospital approached me and shook my hand. "Harold spoke about you every time we met," she said. "He once told me that taking you in was the best decision he ever made. I can see why." She placed a business card in my palm. "When you're ready to discuss that scholarship fund, call me directly." Then Elena appeared beside me and gently squeezed my arm. "You did it," she said softly. "Harold would be so proud." I looked down at the photo of Uncle Harold I had brought with me. I hoped she was right. Let me take a breath here for a second. That was the moment I had feared and needed at the same time. And if you've ever had to stand up to someone who hurt you, especially someone who still believed they were the victim, then you understand how exhausting that kind of moment can be. Have you ever been through something like that? Have you ever had to face someone who hurt you, only to realize they still saw themselves as the victim? Tell me in the comments. And if you want to know what happened after that conference room emptied, stay with me, because the story didn't end there. 1 week after the will reading, Margaret Morrison filed a formal complaint with the Washington State Bar Association. The subject was Victor Harrington's professional conduct. I didn't ask her to do it. She did it because, as an attorney, she had an obligation. When a lawyer becomes aware that another lawyer may have violated professional rules, it has to be reported. The complaint listed 3 major issues. First, conflict of interest. Harrington had previously represented Harold Myers and had access to private information about his estate planning. Second, failure to disclose. Harrington had never told Sandra or Richard that he had once worked with Harold. Third, misleading his own clients. Harrington had allowed Sandra and Richard to believe they had a strong case, even though he knew, or should have known, that their position had serious problems from the start. Margaret kept me informed as the process moved forward. 2 months later, in late May of 2025, the Bar Association issued its decision. Victor Harrington was suspended from practicing law for 6 months. He was also fined $15,000 and ordered to complete additional ethics training. Within weeks, 3 of his biggest clients quietly moved their business to other firms. I later heard through people in the legal community that his firm lost roughly $200,000 in revenue that year. Elena once asked me if I felt satisfied about what happened to him. I didn't do anything to him, I told her. He did it to himself. I was just there when the consequences finally caught up. And that was the truth. I hadn't gone after Victor Harrington. I hadn't filed the complaint. I hadn't pushed for his suspension. He had made his own choices. He accepted a case he should have stayed away from. He misled the people who trusted him. He gambled on pressure instead of truth. His reputation suffered because of his own decisions. Some people build the walls around themselves without anyone else lifting a hand. 3 weeks after the will reading, an email appeared in my inbox. It was from Sandra. The subject line said, "Please read." The message was longer than I expected. Sandra had never been someone who liked putting things in writing. She preferred phone calls where she could control the tone, interrupt, and steer the conversation wherever she wanted. But this time, she wrote, "Diana, I know you probably won't read this, but I need to say some things. I've been thinking about what happened at the will reading. I was angry, and I said things I shouldn't have said. But I want you to know that I understand now that I made mistakes when you were young. I was overwhelmed. Your father and I were struggling financially. Things got away from us. I'm not asking for money. I'm asking for a chance to make things right. We're still family, Diana. Blood doesn't disappear because of legal papers. I'm your mother. Nothing can change that. Can we talk? I think if we just sat down together, we could work through this. I love you. I always have. Mom." I read the email 3 times. Then I called Dr. Hayes, my therapist, and read it to her over the phone. "What stands out to you?" she asked. I sat with that question for a moment. "She says she made mistakes," I said, "but she doesn't actually name them. She blames being overwhelmed and struggling financially. She says she isn't asking for money, but then immediately talks about working things out. And she still signs it as mom, even though she gave up that role in writing." Dr. Hayes was quiet for a second. "What do you want to do?" I took 2 days to write my response. In the end, it was only 4 sentences. "Sandra, I read your email. I forgave you a long time ago, for myself, not for you. But I do not want a relationship with you. Please do not contact me again." She never replied. And for the first time, I didn't feel guilty. I felt clear. 2 months after the will reading, a letter arrived at my Seattle address. Not an email, a real letter, handwritten on plain paper, folded into a slightly wrinkled envelope with a Portland postmark. The return address said T. Warren. Tiffany had taken her former husband's last name when she got married. I opened it carefully, already expecting another attempt to pull me back into something I had worked so hard to leave behind. But this letter was different. "Diana, I'm not writing to ask you for anything. I don't want money. I don't want forgiveness. I just need to say something I should have said 15 years ago. The night Mom and Dad sent you away, I watched from my bedroom window. I saw you sitting on the porch with those garbage bags. I watched for 4 hours. I saw you sitting there alone in the dark, waiting. And I never came downstairs. I could have. I was 15. I could have brought you water. I could have sat beside you. I could have at least told you I was sorry. Instead, I stayed behind that curtain and watched like a coward. And I have carried that moment with me ever since. Every time Mom talked about you, every time she blamed you and made herself sound like the one who had been wronged, I thought about that window. I thought about you sitting outside alone. And I thought about everything I failed to do. I'm not asking you to forgive me. I'm not asking for a relationship. I only wanted you to know that I understand what I did was wrong. I failed you when you needed family the most. You deserved better from your older sister. If you never want to hear from me again, I understand. But I couldn't let another year go by without finally telling you the truth. Tiffany. I read the letter 4 times. It was the first truly honest thing anyone from my biological family had ever said to me. I didn't answer right away. I needed time to understand what this unexpected opening meant to me. I had to figure out whether I wanted to respond at all, and if I did, what kind of door I was willing to open. But for the first time in 15 years, when I thought about Tiffany, I didn't feel only distance. 4 months after the will reading, I finally wrote back. Dr. Hayes had helped me separate what I actually wanted from what I thought I was supposed to want. Not what would make me seem generous, not what would make other people comfortable, not what someone else might call forgiveness, just what I truly wanted for myself. And the answer surprised me. I didn't want to shut Tiffany out completely. Her letter had been the first real acknowledgement of what happened that night. No excuses, no blame shifting, no mention of money, no attempt to make herself the victim. Just accountability. But I also wasn't ready to trust her. 15 years of silence and distance do not disappear because of one honest letter. So I wrote back with boundaries. Tiffany, I've read your letter many times. I appreciate that you acknowledged what happened without making excuses. That took courage. I'm not ready for a full relationship, but I'm willing to try cautious contact under a few conditions. First, no communication through Sandra or Richard. I have permanently ended contact with them, and I need that boundary respected. Second, no conversations about money, inheritance, Uncle Harold's estate, or anything connected to it. Third, I can end any conversation at any time without explaining myself. If I go quiet, I need you to respect that. If you can accept these conditions, we can start with one short video call each month. 15 minutes, low pressure. We can talk about our lives, keep things simple at first, and see where it goes from there. This does not mean everything is forgiven or forgotten. It means I'm willing to find out whether there is anything worth rebuilding, but it has to happen on my terms. Let me know if you accept. Diana. Her response came 3 days later. One word. Accepted. I scheduled our first call for the following Saturday. 15 minutes. That was all I could offer. But it was a start. The first video call with Tiffany happened on a Saturday afternoon in September of 2025, 6 months after the will reading. I sat in my home office with my laptop open, watching the clock move toward 2 p.m. My heart was beating faster than it had during the will reading. Somehow, this felt more dangerous. Facing Sandra had been about protecting myself from someone trying to take control of my story again. This was different. This was about choosing to be open, even a little. The call connected. Tiffany's face appeared on the screen. She looked different from the woman I had seen in that conference room. Less polished, more tired, but also more real. "Hi," she said. "Hi." For a moment, neither of us said anything. 15 years of silence sat between us, squeezed into one small video call window. "I wasn't sure you'd actually answer," she admitted. "I almost didn't." That broke the tension. Tiffany gave a nervous little laugh, and I felt the corner of my mouth almost lift. We kept the conversation light, exactly the way I had asked, surface level. She told me about her job. She was training to become a nail technician and working toward getting licensed. She mentioned her children, Jaden, who was 8, and Lily, who was 6. But she didn't pressure me to become part of their lives. She didn't ask me to be their aunt. I told her a little about the business, the endless Seattle rain, and a few harmless details about my routine. Nothing too personal, nothing too deep. At 14 minutes, I said, "We should probably wrap up." "Diana," Tiffany said, before I could end the call. I paused. "Thank you for giving me a chance," she said. "I know you didn't have to." "This is step 1, I replied. "We'll see where it goes." Step 1 is more than I expected. We scheduled another call for the next month. After she hung up, I stayed in my office for a long time, trying to understand what I felt. I didn't know if Tiffany and I would ever have a real relationship. Maybe we would. Maybe we would always remain in this careful, fragile space. But for the first time, I was the one deciding what came next. And that kind of power was worth more to me than any inheritance. On March 14th, 2026, exactly 1 year after the will reading that changed everything, I stood outside a modest commercial building on Capitol Hill. It was the first property Uncle Harold had ever purchased, back in 1987, when he was 34 years old with a dream and barely enough money for the down payment. The building had been renovated the previous fall. New windows, updated HVAC, fresh landscaping. But that day, I wasn't there for the renovations. I was there for something much more important. A bronze plaque had been mounted beside the main entrance. The Harold R. Myers Building, in memory of a man who chose love over blood, 1953 to 2025. I reached out and touched the letters of his name, feeling the cool metal beneath my fingertips. In the year since the will reading, Myers' property holdings had grown by 12%, bringing the portfolio value to $26.5 million. Occupancy rates stayed above 95%. We had expanded into 2 new properties and completed major upgrades on 3 existing ones. But the number that mattered most to me had nothing to do with real estate. The Myers STEM Scholarship had awarded its first grants. 5 students from difficult family situations received full funding for summer programs in science and mathematics. Dr. Wells from Seattle Children's Hospital helped us choose the recipients. 5 students who just needed someone to believe in them. Tiffany and I still spoke once a month. The calls had become a little easier. We had moved from 15 minutes to 25. I had seen photos of her children. She had seen photos of my apartment. We were not sisters in the traditional sense. Not yet. Maybe not ever. But we were something. Sandra and Richard had stopped trying to contact me. I didn't know much about their lives anymore, and I realized I didn't need to. Elena walked up beside me and looked at the plaque. "You okay?" she asked. I thought about that for a moment. "I'm peaceful," I said. And honestly, peace felt even better than happiness. Uncle Harold had taught me that family is a choice, and after all those years, I had finally learned to choose myself. For the first time in weeks, the sky over Seattle was clear. I could see all the way to the mountains. When I look back at my story now, I think about something I learned in therapy. It's called conditional self-worth. It means believing your value depends on someone else's approval. For the first 13 years of my life, I lived inside that belief. My mother's coldness felt like proof that I wasn't enough. But the truth is, what saved me wasn't Uncle Harold's money. It was his acceptance. He saw me clearly, not as a problem, not as a burden, not as someone who had to earn love by staying quiet. He saw me as I was, and he chose me. That is what I want you to take from this story. You do not need anyone's permission to know your worth. You have the right to set boundaries, even with relatives, even with parents, even with people who share your blood. Forgiveness is something you may choose for your own peace. Reconciliation is something you choose only if it is right for you. They are not the same thing. And no one else gets to decide which one you give. Your story belongs to you. Thank you for staying with me until the end. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever had to rebuild your sense of worth after someone made you question it, I hope you know this. You are not alone. If you want to hear more stories about family boundaries, healing, and finding your own path, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. You can also check the description for more stories like this. Until next time, take care of yourself.